calmando yo. Libre, atrevida y loca. Y con el fuego en la boca. Libre, atrevida y loca. Calmando yo. Y con el fuego hace.
Así que a ti te importa cómo es que me miro. Si con la blusa se me sale el ombligo. Y si esta suerte se queda muy apretada. Si mi cabeza siempre está despeinada. Que si traigo muy corta la falda. Que si traigo como me da la gana. Que las ladies se van a la espalda. Que a ti te importa cómo es que la vida. Si con la blusa se me sale el ombligo. Y si esta suerte se queda muy apretada. Si mi cabeza siempre está despeinada. Que si traigo muy corta la falda. Te sientes libre, libre, la vida, la gana. No le importa y no corta las alas a otras.
Libre, atrevida y loca. Y con el fuego en la boca. Libre, atrevida y loca. Y con el fuego hace.
Hola, ¿qué tal? A mí me dicen Guaguis. Represento al puerto donde se hacen las mejores parties. Con mis hermanas practico la cumbia. Es una religión como el hip hop, que no te queden dudas. Ni técnicas ni rudas, tan solo luchadoras en el ring de la hermosura. Envuélvete en periódico, mira ya madura. Estamos resistiendo porque el mundo tiene cura. Mujeres pisoteadas, hechas una cagada. Pasan los siglos y seguimos basureadas. Esclavas de la puta manada. Y si decimos algo somos brujas y malvadas. Cisternas, carnalas, cabronas, armadas de lírica explosiva, de música pesada. Suena profundo por toda la casa. México, Argentina, en vivo en Guatemala.
Libre, atrevida y loca. Y con el fuego en la boca.
barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Que se vayan, yo la salto. Saltando. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Que se vayan, yo la salto. Arriba. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Si me ponen barrera yo la salto. Que se vayan, yo la salto.
La historia es nuestra y la hacen los pueblos.
Me tumbaron el pandero en la fiesta de la Sanse, me tumbaron el bulto con cartera y celular, me tumbaron la planta que acababa de comprarme, los chavos del retiro y hasta la identidad, me tumbaron las tenis, el carro y la TH y hasta la bicicleta. Oye, qué barbaridad, oye, qué barbaridad. Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más.
Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más.
Nos tumban con mega sueldo, nos tumban con mega sueldo y contratos de millones, nos tumban pa' empobrecernos, se llevan todos esos cabrones. Nos tumban pa' empobrecernos, se llevan todos esos cabrones.
Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más.
Nos tumban pa' enriquecerse, nos tumban pa' enriquecerse. Esa es su misión. Nos tumban cuando privatizan la salud y la educación. Nos tumban cuando privatizan la salud y la educación.
Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más.
Nos tumban con los impuestos, nos tumban con los impuestos que nos ponen a pagar. Nos tumban del presupuesto todo lo que no pueden sacar. Nos tumban del presupuesto todo lo que no pueden sacar.
Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe, vivo en el país del tumbe, yo te lo canto porque es verdad. Vivo en el país del tumbe y aquí el gobierno es quien tumba más. Vivo en el país del tumbe y este gobierno vamos a tumbar.
Y a este gobierno vamos a
Y
tumbar.
este gobierno vamos a tumbar.
Porque estamos hartas del sistema
Y este gobierno vamos
que
a tumbar.
criminaliza a las personas negras y
Y este
pobres.
gobierno vamos a tumbar.
Pa' afuera todos los políticos de
Y este
mentira.
gobierno vamos a
Pa'
tumbar.
afuera la junta solución con perspectiva de género para acabar con el patriarcado y con el colonialismo neoliberal.
They talk about a lot of
Hello there. Hello. Oh my goodness. So excited to be here with you, Harsha.
Oh, so excited to meet you all. Thank you for having me.
This is amazing. Just to let you know, we are live streaming on YouTube. We had a little bit of change of plans here. We were gonna go on Facebook, but it's YouTube what we're doing.
Okay.
And I know that our time is limited and we're just so thankful that you're here. I'm going to dive in. Just wanna first thank everyone for being here. My name is Roxana Bendesu. My pronouns are she, ella. I'm a descendant of the Quechua people of the Andes, and I'm part of a really amazing team at Migrant Roots Media. I greet you from lands that have been and continue to be cared for, shared, and respected by the Ino and Okinichi communities, as well as the Tuscarora Nation in Turtle Island, territory also known as Durham, North Carolina. I mentioned this in a very intentional way because when we talk about forced displacement, as we are going to do tonight, it is also crucial to understand the history of the people who inhabited and inhabit right now the lands where we find ourselves. During the launch of Migrant Roots Media, we had the honor and the privilege of being welcomed by a member of the Okinichi Band of the Saponi Nation, Bivette Jeffries. The ritual performed that morning 2.5 years ago now helped us ground our work. Many of our ancestors, family members, of many here present have also experienced similar struggles. And so just want to say that we see you and we love you. Okay, so now without further ado, let me introduce our guest. We're just so thrilled to have you here. Harsha Walia, a South Asian activist and writer based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And I'll let you, of course, introduce yourself as well. But Harsha is the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism, which, by the way, it is one of the books that our group at Tertulia Migrante has already discussed and loved. Show it here. Harsha is trained in the law. She has been a community organizer in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements, including No One is Illegal, for 2 decades. I should add also that she has been described as one of the most important thinkers on borders and migration in the world. So welcome to Tertulia Migrante, Harsha. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be alongside all of you and to learn alongside you. And I thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled that you all are engaged in collective struggle in so many different ways. And I'm on the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. These are nations whose land continues to be stolen by the illegal Canadian state, yet Indigenous nations continue to thrive and resist on these lands, and their laws and jurisdiction continue to be alive on these lands. And as you noted, Roxana, so much of work against forced displacement and really just the whole history of the border is completely bound up in settler colonialism and enslavement and empire. And so all of these are working together where I'm located as well. So thank you all so much. And I'm so excited to meet you all.
Thank you. Well, we want to make sure that we make time for all these amazing questions that we have. Right now, we are on session 2, actually, of our discussion of your book. And so we don't want to get spoilers, but maybe we do, actually. Of course, since we have you here. So, just briefly to talk about Migrant Roots Media and how it originated, it really originated from something that I believe you've talked in many other spaces, just this frustration of the narratives, the existing narratives of telling stories of migrants from a perspective that really lacks the acknowledgement of the root causes of that displacement. And to us, it was so important really to uplift, to connect the dots, to talk about all the different issues that are invisibilized very much on purpose, to turn this into a conversation that doesn't involve the root causes. And I think your book, or both your books, do a very good job at connecting the dots. So just, first some comments, and then I'm gonna transfer to some of our members for them to ask questions. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's exactly as you noted, which is that, a lot of times immigration is presented as a very domesticated issue, right? Which is, this kind of act of surprise that immigrants or migrants or refugees or undocumented people, all the various state-defined categories that, are intended to divide and conquer people who are on the move. It's an act of surprise, right? About, our borders in crisis. Where did these migrants come from? There's a border surge. Or even the kind of liberal response, right? The liberal humanitarian centrist response, which is still imperialist, of course. And that's presented as, oh, immigrants serve our economy, or, refugees welcome, or that kind of multicultural facade. And all of those responses, either the more overt xenophobic, white supremacist, right-wing response, which is hateful, or the liberal response, which presents itself as colorblind and humanitarian or liberal, but really still is a white savior industrial complex kind of response. Both of those really just reinforce the idea that immigrants are to be managed and contained, right? Without asking the fundamental question of how do people even come to become migrants and refugees, right? Like that is something that is a state-defined category. There would be no migrants or refugees if there were no borders, right? Like that wouldn't exist. And there would be no migrants and refugees. People would be on the move, but there would not be migrants and refugees in the ways that we see migration happening today if it were not for conquest, if it were not for capitalism, if it wasn't for continued extraction, if it wasn't for these long histories of exploitation that reveal the kind of asymmetrical realities of who migrates and under what conditions, right? And so for me, that's something that, as you know, and I think, you all probably share, is this deep frustration with that analysis that really domesticates rather than looks at the global, the internationalist, the transnational ways in which we need to interrogate migration as a function of global violence, as a function of global apartheid, as a function of the long continuities of state violence, capitalist violence, settler colonialism, enslavement, indentureship, oppression, all of these different ways in which we're marked by hierarchy and violence and oppression. And so to me, migration is bound up in these global forces, right? Like we can't talk about migration unless we're also talking about anti-capitalism, anti-war, anti-imperialism, anti-militarism. And something that's always stood out to me was hearing essentially the refrain that migrants really are the human face of global forces, right? Like when a migrant shows up at the border, that is the human face of the devastation of imperialism, the human face of the devastation of NAFTA, the human face of the devastation of climate change. So that really, and I'm not alone in this analysis, right? This is a shared analysis that comes from community, that comes from movement, that we need to blow open how we think about migration to refuse the box of the right and the liberal centrists, and to really create our own narrative, as you said.
And that story is really us, right? And I always say, with, of course, acknowledging privilege, but it's many of us, right? In so many ways, these root causes have affected folks in various spaces. And we have gotten here either, flying, walking, of course, on the other side of the world, in small, what do you call it? The small floaters and whatnot. So there's that aspect as well, that these stories have to come from us. However, we need this space to reflect about our histories, right? Not only about what just happened to us, but also what's the context, what's the historical context? Why did we even had to, feel forced to make that decision, being pushed to make that decision? And many of us, unfortunately, have not had that opportunity. That's really one of the reasons why Migrant Roots Media is very I guess, intentional about bringing our own community together to lead this, to take the mics of different spaces and to not let others tell our own stories, but for us to tell our own stories and do our own research and, you know, as well as much as we can, of course, because there's so many stories that are likely forever lost, honestly, because of colonization, because of mass extinction that has happened in our communities of origin. And so really quickly, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Ale Mejia. She is from Honduras, actually, was raised in Panama. She's a migrant and the chief editor of Migrant Roots Media, and has a question for you. Ale?
Hi, Harsha. We're so excited to have you here, and I love your work. I really admire you, so I'm just like really excited. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So my question is sort of related to this idea of the root causes of migration. So it's connected to the analysis that we have at Migrant Roots about like root causes of migration, and obviously the analysis that you put forward in your own, you know, scholarship and activist work. So we were wondering, you know, this is a question. As you know, one of the Biden-Harris administration's primary talking points for their immigration platform, and then also connected to like their domestic policy, or sorry, foreign policy platform, is to address the root causes of migration as well, specifically from Central America. So Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala specifically. And this notion that they have of the root causes of migration is actually, in my opinion, a facade to just bring in like more foreign investments into the region. So it's not actually about like, you know, the prosperity and hope for the people, but it's about bringing in like free market capitalism into Central America, like even more intensely, right? So I'm curious to hear, like, what are your thoughts on the co-optation of the root causes terminology that we have been hearing from the Biden-Harris administration? And in recent cases, we've seen it with Harris visiting Guatemala and telling migrants not to come to the US. And this is part of like the root causes of migration tour that the administration is kind of going around in Guatemala and then at the US-Mexico border. So yeah, so my question is just like, what do you think about the co-optation of the language?
I'm so excited to meet you too. And thank you for that wonderful question. Yeah, and I think it's a timely one, right? Precisely because of the tour and their comments that they're making. And I think it's important to place the kind of root causes of migration comment and the tour in, you know, both a transnational arc and a historic arc. So, you know, the one thing that we know is that one of the ways in which the root causes of migration has been weaponized is precisely to deter people from moving, right? By saying, oh, if we address the root causes of migration, then people will not be on the move. And really, in some ways, this is not new at all. This is like straight out of the Democrat handbook, because in the 1990s, one of the things that Bill Clinton said was exactly that when he passed NAFTA. And I think your observation is very accurate, that the ways in which the Democratic Party wants to look at and resolve root causes of migration, if you will, is more capitalism, right? It's the idea of capitalist trickle down, which we know is not trickle down. We know it's all trickle up. But that is exactly what they believe, right? They believe that neoliberalism will mitigate against poverty and therefore people will not migrate. And, you know, in 1993, just before NAFTA was passed, which, you know, the Zapatistas call the death sentence, just before NAFTA was passed, Bill Clinton said exactly, paraphrased, that NAFTA would bring prosperity, particularly to indigenous and landless and rural and peasant Mexicans, and it would resolve the root causes of migration, right? So its history is replaying itself in the same way. That was the reason that was given for the passing of NAFTA. And at the same time, which is also history repeating itself, is that the US Army Corps of Engineers started militarizing the US border, right? So Operation Gatekeeper, all of the kind of prevention through deterrence mechanisms that played out in 1994 came exactly at the same time where the US government claimed to be dealing with the root causes of migration through NAFTA. And that's exactly what's happening now with the Biden-Harris administration, both with their root causes of migration tour and their commentary, and also at the same time still militarizing the border. And now increasingly by outsourcing the border, right? So we don't just see, you know, Biden has promised that he's not going to put any more money into the border wall. And a lot of people think that's good news. But really, as we know, the one of the pillars of the Clinton era, of the Barack Obama era, and that will now be the pillar of the Biden and Harris administration, is actually border outsourcing, right? Where they're paying the Mexican government, for example, to increase border enforcement, where they're paying Guatemala, Honduras, you know, Nicaragua, just so many countries, increasingly El Salvador, are getting roped into border enforcement. And, you know, here there's also this, so there's this historical arc that's playing out again. And also this is internationally playing out, you know, so the European Union, as we know, the world's deadliest border is actually the Mediterranean, right? Thousands and thousands of people die every year trying to cross into the Mediterranean, particularly from North and Western Africa, from the Sahel region of Africa, and also from the Middle East, right? And so it's completely bound up in this long arc of European colonization, right? This long arc of anti-Black racism, of anti-migrant exclusion. And in the EU, there's an entire campaign called the Migration Prevention Campaign. And in the International Organization of Migration, which operates globally, has for a long time been working on this framework that they call voluntary repatriation, which is the idea of we're going to send migrants back, but we will do it by giving them money, right? So you self-deport by giving them money. And at the same time, they're giving money to a number of countries in North and Western Africa. In fact, there is no single trade agreement that has been signed by the EU with African states that does not involve an immigration clause, right? That does not involve a migration prevention clause. And the same thing is playing out where the EU is saying now that, oh, we're dealing with the root causes of migration, right? And a lot of times this also takes the language of anti-trafficking, right? Or anti-narco trafficking or anti-smuggling, that we're doing this to benefit migrants. And, you know, all that means is that it means more trade agreements. It means more exploitation. It means more mining agreements. It means more capitalist agreements. It means more green land grabbing, right? It means more poverty. It means more austerity, and it means more border militarization, right? So the kind of weaponization of root causes of migration when it comes from the neoliberal capitalist colonial state is total garbage, right? It's just a way for them to say no to the free movement of people while continuing to create conditions where people have to be on the move, right? And so in many ways, it's predictable. It's repeating itself through history. It's repeating itself through many other geographies as well. And I think it's really, you know, it's great that you're asking this question and that you all have this analysis, because unfortunately, as you probably witnessed, so many people are buying this co-optation, right? People are not necessarily seeing through it. And there's this kind of confusion around like, oh, well, Biden and Harris are talking about the root causes of migration. What does this mean? This is confusing. But in many ways, it's not confusing. This is exactly how neoliberalism and liberalism works, right?
Exactly. Thank you for that answer, Harsha. And we have a whole report about that. Putting the link on the YouTube channel. It's a report about that plan that the Biden administration put together for Central America. But really quickly, let me pass it to my colleague, Linda Brito. Linda is a migrant justice organizer and the policy director of Migrant Roots Media. Linda?
Hi, Harsha. Nice to meet you. Hopefully, you all can hear me. I apologize in advance for the background noise. But yeah, I will share Alia's excitement of having the opportunity to share the space with you and share this incredible analysis that you have. So my question is, in your introduction, you warn readers from falling into this, what you describe as the liberal dichotomy of positioning systems that pass off as progressive as alternatives to systems that are overtly racist in enforcement of their immigration policy. When we know that at the core, they're both tools of violent tools of border imperialism. What messaging do you believe is critical that organizers use when calling for the dismantling of all systems that exist as products of racial capitalism?
Thank you for that. I'm so happy to meet you too and to learn more about all this good work that's happening. that's a good question. It's a hard question because I think, in many ways, and I recognize this as someone who, has come from movement, is that it's in some ways easier to theorize and use language than it is to think through how to build movements and campaigns around it, right? Because we're often caught in the day-to-day. We're caught in the reality. We're caught in terms of messaging, how to meet people where they're at, how to articulate demands that speak to the moment or the individual situation while having this broader analysis. And so I recognize that that's like a process that has to be worked out, that needs to be think through, that really depends on the context. So, take everything I say with a grain of salt, that it's hard to be prescriptive. But I think some of the general things that I try to think about is, how to, no matter what work we're doing, hold on to that broader analysis, right? So that no matter what work we're doing, we're holding on to this analysis of forced displacement, that we're holding on to holding the state accountable, and that we're also always critical about, say there's an immigration reform bill. And sometimes we have to assess, right? Is this going to be beneficial? Who is this going to throw under the bus? How does this reproduce really the good versus bad immigrant, right? Desirable versus undesirable, all of those different hierarchies that is really so deeply entrenched in immigration work and in immigration reform work, right? Someone's always left behind, right? And so in all of that, movement that I was part of is No One is Illegal. And so in its name itself, no matter what you're organizing against or organizing for, it was always obvious that we had a broader vision. Like, it's literally in the name, right? No matter what you're saying. So that was one way for us that we always held that line, is that no matter what, we still believe this. We still believe in this broader philosophy and ethic. But I think, another guiding principle really is, for me, from the work of, the trajectory from the Black Panther Party to critical resistance and, many other abolitionists in our current contemporary era, who articulate the difference between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms as well, right? So reformist reforms as those that reinforce the status quo, that reinforce the configuration of the state, versus non-reformist reforms that make it possible for collective liberation, that open up that space a little bit more. And so I think, those are ways to kind of continue to ground the work in the radical visions that we have, while still being practical about what might be needed in a moment that speaks to the reality, right? Like, such that if we're arguing for no borders, if we're arguing for no human being is illegal, if we're arguing for the abolition of the border industrial complex, that we can then assess anything against that, right? So if I'm advocating for something, does it increase the possibility? Does it take me towards that path? Or is it actually taking me in a regressive direction? And so I think that evaluation is always a part of thinking through how to formulate analysis or demands that meets that moment. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Really quickly, because we're running out of time, I'm going to pass it to Amana Berra. Aman is an organizer with the Demilitarized Durham to Palestine Coalition and Movement to End Racism and Islamophobia. And I should add that he has been an amazing supporter of Migrant Roots Media. Aman?
Yeah, thanks, Roxana. Yeah, really excited to get to ask this question to you in person, Harsha. So yeah, with just a few minutes left, many people believe that sending developmental aid to places like Central America is good, and they may agree with the Biden-Harris administration plan for Central America as it's laid out. We were interested in kind of what are the problems with this popular idea around developmental aid, and what's a good way of kind of explaining why it's not a good solution to address the root causes of migration and forced displacement.
Thank you for that great question. And I will be quicker in case there's more questions, and I have a few more minutes after too. I think maybe in brief, the two issues with the kind of framework of development aid. The first is that development aid maintains, as Eduardo Galeano would remind us, the idea of charity, right? So when he says that solidarity is horizontal, charity is vertical, development aid maintains the imperialist relationship and structure between the so-called global north and the global south, right? Like, the global north and global south are not geographies, they're political constructions where the global south only exists because of the accumulation of the global north. And so development aid is essentially charity, right? Where those that have accumulated at the expense of others are able to not atone for the way in which that accumulation is structured, but to kind of configure it as charity. So that is, I think, the one thing. And of course, Walter Rodney's really seminal work around the framework of development and underdevelopment is so crucial here. The second thing I think around development aid is really that international perspective that we gained from the 1990s, for example, of how the Bretton Woods institutions work, right? Like how does the World Bank work? How does the IMF work? And how does structural adjustment work? Because development aid really is structural adjustment, where aid comes with a lot of conditions, or what we know as tied aid. And the United States is infamous for this, where, for example, in Central America, as well as Haiti, as well as the Dominican Republic, so much aid has meant and has come with the conditions of capitalism, right? Where you get aid, but you have to open up your economy to the dumping of Miami rice. Or you get aid, but it is contingent on you opening up a sweatshop factory and an export processing zone in Haiti. And so a lot of development aid is actually what's called tied aid, where countries then become effectively even more indebted to the so-called developing state, and further entrenches austerity and neoliberalism and colonization and land theft.
Thank you for that. Oh, we could have a whole nother session on that, I'm sure. But I'm going to pass it to our friend Roxanne Scott. Roxanne is a radio reporter in Georgia. Roxanne?
Thank you for being here. I wanted to know how reporters can cover immigration, immigrant communities, migration with a critical eye at organizations that are funded and meant to help migrants. And in my mind, we have a lot of resettlement agencies here in Georgia, or the UN, or other nonprofits.
Oh, these are such great questions. I think in terms of reporting in general, I'd say, and this is, perhaps true for all reporting, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this too, is I think with reporting, it's the balance between the kind of humanizing stories, right? How central stories are, and refusing the kind of dehumanizing language of, for example, illegal or border, all of the ways in which language works to stigmatize and dehumanize. And also at the same time, to hold the state responsible, right? Like that it's not just about immigrant stories in a kind of voyeuristic way, but also that ultimately it's about holding the state accountable for border violence, and not treating these stories as passive. Sometimes even like really well-written stories about border deaths, for example, still presented as a tragedy rather than a completely preventable disaster, right? Like border deaths only happen because of border policies that are intended to kill. And so I think that kind of, and for me that I write about in Border and Rule, like my intent was to shift the gaze from these constant narratives of immigrants and refugees to like, why is this even happening, right? Like, why is so much death happening at the border? And then I think in terms of larger agencies, also those deeper questions around like, what does resettlement and integration mean in a capitalist, white supremacist, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous state, right? Like so much of immigration work is that quote unquote integration work. That is, intending to force assimilation onto communities. And so how to balance, again, those stories that are, feel good kind of stories about, the recent refugees who now have a successful business, with, what is the price of citizenship, right? Ultimately, what is the price and meaning of citizenship at the end of the day?
Thank you. And actually, that's one of the reasons why we partner up with an organization called Press On. And we've been working to reach reporters and media makers to shift those narratives and to start talking about this real root causes, historical context, to really change the terminology that is being used, and to really change the narratives that are just not even just they're harmful. Honestly, they're very harmful, and it just continues supporting this myths about about migration and what it is and who and how people migrate and what. So anyway, it's such an important aspect to look into, and I'm really happy that Roxanne Scott is here with us. I think that we connected through Press On originally. So well, so those were our questions. We want to respect your time, of course, but if you have any final comments, any wisdom that you want to share with us, we would just love to hear it.
Thank you so much. I think the wisdom is with all of you. So I'm so excited to meet all of you. Thank you so much for engaging me in this work, and more importantly, the movements that you're part of. Yeah, and I'm feel free to reach out anytime. I'm so happy to meet you all, and thank you all so much for your very good and important work.
You're muted, Roxana.
Just wanted to say that I think we can find a lot of your wisdom right here. So we're so thankful.
Thank you.
We're so very thankful to you. All right, well, have a good night, and we will see you hopefully once again in the future. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining. Oh my goodness, hi.
Did you see a kid's face? That's my kid.
I want to say hello.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.